You think it's your fault. But it's not, and they know it. The burden of responsibility is often an invisible yet overwhelming weight. It lodges itself in the curve of our spine, tightens the chest, and whispers accusations at midnight. It is a weight we carry for events, circumstances, and outcomes that, deep down, we know we did not fully control. We live in a society that, while valuing autonomy and empowerment, has a disturbing tendency to quickly assign blame, and often, the finger points at the victim or those who are already emotionally more vulnerable. This dynamic is particularly cruel when it manifests in contexts of emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, and toxic environments, whether in the family, professional, or romantic sphere. The silent phrase echoing in the minds of so many is, "You think it's your fault, but it's not." And what is most painful and insidious is the terrible certainty that they know it. But before we dive into the depths of this emotional manipulation and the painful journey of self-discovery, allow me to pause and interact directly with you who are reading these words. Have you ever found yourself trapped in a cycle where doubt about your own competence, worth, or sanity was constantly fueled by another person? Can you identify a moment in your life where you were made to feel guilty for something that, in retrospect, was undeniably the responsibility or the result of someone else's actions? If so, you are far from alone. Millions of hearts carry this same invisible scar. Reflecting on these moments is not just an exercise in memory, it is the crucial first step toward deconstructing the imposed narrative and reclaiming one's own truth. The architecture of misplaced guilt is meticulous and cruel. Manipulators, whether they are narcissists, sociopaths, or simply individuals with deep insecurities and a lack of empathy, operate with surgical precision on the minds of their victims. They do not attack directly, instead, they create a psychological habitat where uncertainty thrives. They use gaslighting, that nefarious tactic of making the victim doubt their own memory, perception, and sanity, as a primary weapon. Small distortions of facts, denial of events that occurred, and the constant role reversal create a dense fog. The victim, confused and exhausted from the struggle to maintain their own reality, begins to give in. It is easier, at a certain point of emotional exhaustion, to internalize the blame than to continue battling against a force that seems to have all the answers and arguments at its disposal, even if they are false. The defense mechanism that should protect the victim is hijacked. Healthy self-criticism transforms into incessant self-flagellation. The question, "What did I do wrong?" replaces the much more pertinent, "What is being done to me that is wrong?" This inversion is the triumph of the manipulator. They no longer need to exert so much effort in external manipulation, as the victim becomes their own tormentor, applying the whip of guilt with more fervor than the oppressor themselves ever could. The silence that follows, the acceptance of their own failure, is what allows the aggressor to continue their destructive pattern, free from responsibility or consequence. They absolve themselves, while the victim sinks. And it is precisely at this point that the greatest and saddest irony resides. They observe the pain, the internalization of guilt, and they know perfectly well that the responsibility does not belong to the victim. This tacit knowledge, this cold awareness, is what makes the action heinous. The pain of this realization is excruciating. When the fog begins to lift, usually after a period of distance, therapy, or the support of others, the victim is confronted with the stark truth. It is not just that the fault was not theirs, it is that the other person knew it wasn't. This revelation is a mixture of relief and fury, but predominantly, it is a deep sadness for the injustice of lost time, wasted energy, and crushed self-esteem. It is the grief for the version of oneself that was systematically dismantled to serve another person's selfish purposes. It is the moment when the emotional wound moves from a bruise to an open fracture, because the betrayal was not only in the actions but in the perverse intent to transfer one's own moral and ethical burden. Recovery is an arduous process, paved with the need to rewrite one's own story. It is necessary to unlearn the language of blame and relearn the language of self-forgiveness. It is essential to recognize that empathy, which was exploited and used as a weakness, is actually a strength. Highly empathetic people are easy targets for manipulators because they feel pain and have an innate tendency to take responsibility to restore harmony. The manipulator exploits this desire for peace and balance, throwing the bomb of guilt and stepping back to watch the damage. Therefore, the first act of rebellion and self-care is to recognize that your empathy is not a defect, but an internal compass that was momentarily misaligned. This awakening process is like emerging from a deep and confusing sleep. The eyes need to adjust to the light of truth, and the body, to the absence of the previous weight. Memory must be revalidated. What was previously remembered with the color of guilt and error must be reviewed in the light of clarity and victimization. It is crucial to seek evidence, whether written, testimonial, or merely the validation of one's own internal emotions and perceptions. Therapy, in this context, is not just a treatment, it is a mirror that reflects reality without the distortions created by the aggressor. It is where the inner voice, long silenced, finds the safe space to scream the truth. Society, in general, needs to become more aware of these subtle patterns of abuse. Physical abuse is visible and generates immediate repulsion, but emotional abuse, the transfer of blame, and gaslighting operate in the shadows, often disguised as constructive criticism, concern, or even love. We must educate ourselves and future generations about the warning signs, the constant feeling of being at fault, the fear of expressing one's own opinion, the incessant need to apologize for one's very existence, and the perception that joy and success are immediately followed by some form of punishment or destructive criticism. The loneliness that accompanies the internalization of guilt is one of the saddest aspects of this experience. The victim isolates themselves, ashamed and convinced that the world, just like the aggressor, will judge them for their failures. This isolation is the last gift the manipulator desires, as it ensures the victim will not have access to sources of external validation that could dismantle the narrative of blame. Breaking this isolation is an act of monumental courage. It is reaching out and whispering, "I need help, and I am not the monster they made me believe I was." The response that should be found in friends, family, and mental health professionals must always be one of unconditional validation and acceptance. The journey of grief, in this case, is not only for the loss of a relationship or a situation but for the loss of one's own innocence and the naive faith in the goodness of others. It is necessary to mourn the person you were forced to be to survive, and then to welcome, with care and tenderness, the person you truly are. This is the true resurrection. The pain transforms into strength, and the experience, which seemed like a condemnation, becomes a source of wisdom and renewed empathy for others going through similar situations. Many ask if there is a solution for this type of dynamic. The solution, in the sense of fixing the manipulator, is almost always a dangerous mirage. The most powerful insight for the victim is to accept that the only real solution lies in removal and autonomy. The solution is to move away from the source of toxicity, establish unbreakable boundaries, and invest massively in one's own psychological and emotional well-being. The truth, both liberating and painful, is that it is not possible to change those who do not want to be changed, and it is not possible to save those who do not recognize that they are drowning, especially when that person benefits from watching others sink. The real game changer occurs when the victim, now survivor, realizes that the only person who needs their approval is themselves. The aggressor's voice, which became the inner critical voice, must be silenced with the voice of truth and self-love. This is not a quick process. It takes time, effort, and often tears. But every small step, each time the person refuses to apologize for something they did not do, each time they validate their own perception against the old gaslighting narrative, is a monumental victory in the war for one's own soul. The final message, for anyone carrying this weight, is, you are not the culprit. They know it. Use this truth as the foundation to rebuild the house of your life. Let the anger turn into energy for change, and the sadness, into compassion for yourself. The path is long, but the destination is freedom. From today, your story is told by your voice, and not by the poisonous whisper of others' guilt. Now, reflect for a moment on your personal experience or that of someone you know. Do you believe that, in cases like the one discussed, where the manipulation is so profound and the internalization of guilt so complete, the victim can fully free themselves and achieve a real and lasting solution to the trauma, or do the scars of gaslighting and responsibility transfer remain as an insurmountable obstacle to full happiness? What is your opinion on the subject, and do you believe that the case itself has a solution?